Good day. One of the features of the international situation or world politics is that when situation seems to be generally calm or becoming calmer, something invariably flares up. And in fact, we've just received news of a major flare-up in an important place, which is the Central Asian Republic of Kazakhstan, which was, of course, a former constituent republic of the Soviet Union. Now, we are getting very confused reports about what exactly is happening in Kazakhstan. It seems that there's been an outburst of protests. The reason there has been an outburst of protests, or at least the overt reason that there has been an outburst of protests, is because a few days ago the Kazakh government scrapped price caps on liquefied gas, petrol, which, because of those price caps, has become the fuel of choice for motor vehicles for many people in Kazakhstan. This caused prices of LGP, I shall call it henceforth, to double. That obviously was unpopular, and that provoked protests, and those protests continue even as the government has now restored those price caps and has itself resigned. Now, that is, it seems to me, a facile explanation for what is happening. Clearly, people are upset and unhappy about the fact that these price caps have been lifted, but it can't be the whole or even the main part of the reason for these protests. But before I actually turn to that, I do want to say one thing about the problem of price caps and price controls, which is that governments are often tempted to introduce them either for general economic reasons, because they want to direct economic investment into particular sectors, or more often in order to pacify feeling amongst the population. What that, however, does is that it makes people quickly come to the view that these price caps are somehow a form of economic entitlement. And governments that do this discover two things begin to happen. Firstly, it becomes extremely difficult politically to lift the price caps or price controls, because people become extremely angry when they are lifted. And of course, the surge in prices that follows the lifting of price caps becomes even more inflammatory and causes even greater anger. And the second is that imposing price controls and price caps creates a system of subsidies and cross-subsidies, which ultimately distort the development of an economy and create imbalances, and often make for an overcomplicated situation which drains investment. Having said that, it's also important to say that in countries where people live on the margins, the importance of price caps to people's everyday well-being or ability to get by simply cannot be underestimated. So it's understandable why technocrats in countries, especially countries which are already facing inflation problems, are anxious to lift price caps, but it is also understandable why doing so politically can be deeply destabilizing, and why people who have become accustomed to them and have structured their livelihoods around them become very angry indeed when they are lifted. We are, by the way, experiencing something of a similar sort, obviously on a much less toxic scale, in Britain, where the British government has long had a policy of capping prices for gas, which is used as heating fuel by the great majority of British homes. The result is, however, that there is a crisis underway on the part of energy producers in Britain, some of which are quite small companies and which are finding it all but impossible to balance the price gaps, the fact that they are unable to pass on price rises, wholesale price rises, onto their customers, even as energy prices in general have been rising. There was recently a very interesting article, editorial, in the Daily Telegraph of all places, which pointed out that the government at the moment in Britain is facing a serious problem. If it doesn't lift the price caps on gas fuel to British homes, there will be a economic crisis within the energy sector. If it does lift those price caps, it will face a severe political backlash from an angry British public, and that could, of course, hit its political standing. That, of course, is hardly the whole comparable to the situation in Kazakhstan, and coming back to Kazakhstan, undoubtedly it is not the whole story. Now, before I proceed to discuss the situation in Kazakhstan itself, it's essential to understand that this is a country which I suspect most people, at least in the United States, have not heard of, at least most people, other than those who get their picture of the country perhaps from Borat films and things of that kind. It is actually a critically important country. It was obviously one of the biggest republics of the former Soviet Union. It is a major producer of raw materials and food, and it is a key ally of Russia, a key ally with some important qualifications, because the previous leader of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was a former member, by the way, of the Soviet Politburo, but who remained in post as first secretary of the Kazakh Communist Party after the Soviet Union dissolved, and then converted that position into a position of, in effect, Kazakhstan's perpetual president and leader after the Soviet Union collapsed and communism ended. Nazarbayev, though outwardly and to all appearances an ally of Russia, at the same time, and rather like Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, always sought to play the Russians to some extent off the West. And he worked hard to maintain good relations with important Western countries. He was particularly close, in addition, to President Erdogan of Turkey. And he did certain things which the Russians, it's fairly clear, were not at all happy with. So, for example, he Latinized the Kazakh alphabet from Cyrillic, a step which clearly distanced Kazakhstan from Russia. And of course, he did another thing which I was actually in the hall in the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum when he explained it. He also set up in Kazakhstan, or at least tried to set up in Kazakhstan, a commercial court which applied English commercial law. In other words, he sought to transfer much of the legal system in Kazakhstan away from Russia, away in some ways from its Soviet roots, by adopting the legal system of Russia's most implacable enemy, which is Britain. As I said, I was in the hall when he was explaining it, and I remember, this is in St. Petersburg, I think in 2016, I remember the absolute silence in the hall from the Russian audience when he discussed it. So this was Russia's friend, its ally in Kazakhstan, taking a step which, as I said, many Russians were extremely upset about and probably annoyed with. And on top of that, Nazarbayev perhaps inevitably pursued a policy of what you might call Kazakhstanization, in the sense that he steadily tried to make Kazakhstan more Kazakh, closer to its Kazakh community, and in effect was taking steps to limit and to some extent even expel the large Russian community in Kazakhstan, which at various points actually was in history was actually probably the majority of the actual population in the region. That's no longer the case anymore, by the way. One of the steps that he took was that he transferred the capital of Kazakhstan from its former major administrative and business and cultural center, which was Almaty, a city which at the time when the Soviet Union broke up had a majority Russian population. And he created an entirely new capital, initially called Astana, but now named after himself, Nursultan. And obviously this was partly an attempt to remove the Kazakh government away from a city where Russia appeared to have an excessive amount, or Russians appear to have an excessive amount of influence. So, as I said, though Nazarbayev, to all outward appearances, was a staunch ally of Russia and a staunch supporter of integration processes within the former Soviet Union, in practice, and rather like Lukashenko in Belarus, he liked to play something of a double game. Anyway, back in 2019, to many people's surprise, he announced his resignation. And a new man took over, the current president, Mr. Tokayev. But in practice, this change, this transfer of power from Nazarbayev to Tokayev, a person who Nazarbayev appeared to have handpicked, this transfer of power meant less than it seemed, because though Nazarbayev had in theory resigned, he in fact remained very much in control of many of the key levers of power in Kazakhstan. Importantly, he remained in control of the Security Council, and via that his position as chairman of the Security Council, he was in effect in control of Kazakhstan's military, of its armed forces. So though the president, Tokayev, was the nominal head of state, the person in charge of the civilian administration of the country, it was quite obvious to most people who were following things closely that Nazarbayev remained not just very influential, but overall the person in charge. Now, I think that one of the sub-stories to these protests is resentment of the people of Almaty, which Nazarbayev renamed Almaty, again as a step to distance Kazakhstan from Russia. Anyway, resentment on the part of the people of the city, Almaty as I shall henceforth call it, at the fact that the capital had been transferred to Astana, the city which is now Kazakhstan's capital, where the government is located, where Nazarbayev and Tokayev are both based, and which of course is now named Nursultan after Nazarbayev himself. So I get the sense that over and on top of these protests over the LGP rises, there is a certain resentment in Almaty at the fact that the capital was transferred away from the city. Now, it's important to say that Nursultan, Astana as it once was, the capital of Kazakhstan, glittering metropolis though it is, sort of place with all sorts of extraordinary architecture of the kind that people like Nazarbayev like to build, extraordinary modernist buildings and all the rest, even though it is not in the sense that Almaty is a real city. Almaty remains far and away the most important city in Kazakhstan. It accounts for something like a fifth of Kazakhstan's GDP. It is the biggest city in Kazakhstan, and it is also its major cultural metropolis. So it's perhaps not surprising if many people in Almaty feel resentful at the fact that the capital was transferred to Nursultan. One also gets the sense that, as perhaps inevitably happens when a government pursues a policy of Kazakhstanization or nativist policies directed at a very large community, the Russian community in its midst. And it's important to say that the Russians who live in Kazakhstan would not, and who used to live in Kazakhstan, would not have considered themselves settlers. They were living, they transferred to what, so far as they were concerned, was a constituent republic of their country, which was the Soviet Union. So they would not have thought of themselves as settlers in a colonial sense. Anyway, this targeting of this community has inevitably created tensions between native Kazakhs and Russians. And just a few weeks ago, I was hearing reports about aggressive steps taken by Kazakhs, some Kazakh crowds, against Russians, attacking Russians in the streets, supposedly, when they were talking in Russian and insisting that they must in future speak Kazakh. So this would have been obviously another subcurrent of tension. And in Almaty, which remains by far Kazakhstan's most cosmopolitan city, Russians still account for around a quarter of the population. It's quite likely that those tensions are particularly strong. So there are all of these factors at play also. It's quite clear to me that another cause of the problems in Kazakhstan is one of divided authority. I said that Nazarbayev resigned as president in 2019 and was succeeded by Mr. Tokayev, who Mr. Nazarbayev appeared to have handpicked. But it's increasingly looking as if there was some sort of power struggle underway over the last few weeks between the two men. I got the strong impression at a time of a conference in St. Petersburg about 2 weeks ago of the heads of state of the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States, the strange creation set up by Boris Yeltsin to bring together the various Soviet republics after the USSR broke up, and which still exists in some kind of vestigial form. It was quite interesting that when all the heads of state and government of the various ex-Soviet republics that remain part of the Commonwealth of Independent States gathered together in St. Petersburg, both Nazarbayev and Tokayev were present, and that Nazarbayev apparently insisted on a private meeting with Putin before the actual meeting of heads of state and government actually took place. And you can find a brief readout of this meeting on Putin's presidential website. At the time, I thought this highly odd, and it did cross my mind that perhaps relations between Tokayev and Nazarbayev were not entirely easy. And the events of the last couple of days, the last couple of hours, have reinforced that view, because it is striking that Nazarbayev has made no comment about the protests whatsoever. He's not come out to say that he supports Tokayev and the government. He's not issued a call for calm in Almaty. He's said absolutely nothing. Now, that might be because he's trying to undermine Tokayev, and the fact that he had a meeting with Putin, a private meeting with Putin, might suggest it. Or it could be that Tokayev feels that any statement by Nazarbayev would undermine his own authority and might, if anything, even inflame the situation. And that perhaps means that he's preventing Nazarbayev from speaking out. But the fact that there are these two leaders, both in effect in charge or wielding great power in Kazakhstan at one and the same time, has had a further consequence. Because I said at the start of this program that Tokayev is the nominal president. Up to today, Nazarbayev has been chairman of Kazakhstan's Security Council and therefore in overall charge of the country's armed forces. And the effect of that is that it has not been possible to deploy the full weight of Kazakhstan's security forces to places like Almaty to quell the protests there without his agreement, without his consent. And one does get the sense that over the last few hours, that consent has not been forthcoming, so that the whole situation in Almaty has been left to the local police to deal with, and they're finding it increasingly difficult, clearly, to do so. It seems that over the last few hours, crowds stormed the mayor's office. It's now been regained. Control of it has apparently been regained by the police, but the crowd then moved on to the former presidential palace, Nazarbayev's residence, when Almaty was still the country's capital, and they stormed it and put it on fire. So, without clearly a much bigger presence from the country's security forces, not just the army, but the various interior ministry troops and all those security forces that all former Soviet states possess, it's been much more difficult for the police to get on top of the situation, even though from what I can glean, the actual size of the crowds that have been protesting in Almaty has not been very big. Anyway, that may explain that power struggle that looks to be underway between Tokayev and Nazarbayev, may explain certain of the moves that have happened over the last couple of hours. Because Tokayev has used the protests to sack the government which lifted the price caps on LGP, and that may be his way of clearing out a part of the administration, part of the government that still tended to see Nazarbayev as the person who was in overall charge. But we've also heard further reports today that Tokayev has now taken direct charge of the Security Council, apparently ousting Nazarbayev from his position as chair. If that is correct, then it looks as if Tokayev is now finally assuming full control of the government, that he's winning out, if you like, in this power struggle in Nursultan between Nazarbayev and himself. And we also learn that Tokayev is now saying that he's, as chairman of the Security Council, he's going to use that position to carry out a crackdown in Almaty, so that presumably the full weight of the security forces, which have been withheld up to now, will now be deployed. Well, that's, it seems to me, part of the internal explanation for all of these events. There's clearly, as I said, great anger on the part of many people in Kazakhstan at the lifting of the price caps. There's been a sense that the political leadership in the country has been divided and weak, with conflicting lines of authority and uncertainty as to who is in charge, and some evidence of a power struggle. And of course, we've also have the inter-ethnic tensions between Kazakhs and Russians, which might be playing something of a role in this matter. But all of these are internal explanations, and already there are people in Russia who are saying that there are external ones too. And I come back to my key point that, of course, Kazakhstan is a critically important ally of Russia. First of all, it's a huge country. The Baikonur Cosmodrome, from whence Russia launches its spacecraft, is located there. It is a country with which Russia continues to have strong economic contacts. It is deeply integrated economically with Russia. It is part of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization and part of the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. It is also located in a critical region, Central Asia, which the Russians very much consider to be, politically speaking, their back door, but also their soft underbelly. And of course, it is also on the route to China, or at least one of the routes to China. And there are known to be interconnections between Kazakhs and Uyghurs in Western China. And of course, there's a whole issue about their relationship as well. And last but not least, Kazakhs. There is a Muslim presence in Kazakhstan, apparently not very strong, and it seems, from what I've been told, not all Kazakhs are Muslims. But regardless, there is also concerns that jihadism might perhaps one day gain a foothold there. So the Russians are looking at this situation in Kazakhstan with a very, very careful eye. And of course, the Chinese will be also, for very much the same reasons. This is, as I said, a critical, pivotal state, one that links China and Russia together, one which anchors Russian and, by the way, Chinese influence in Central Asia, one which is absolutely crucial to the proper functioning of the Eurasian institutions, the Eurasian Economic Community. The Russians are building the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and of course the Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese are also busy promoting in Central Asia and in Russia as well. And of course these protests have happened in the run-up to these crucial security talks that are coming up in Geneva between the United States and Russia on the 10th of January, in which the Russians will be seeking legally binding security guarantees from the West, a commitment to end NATO expansion, a commitment for the United States to pull back its military forces and infrastructure from Russia's borders and from the territories of the states of the former Warsaw Pact, a commitment by the United States to pull back all its nuclear weapons from countries like Germany and Turkey, and, by the way, Japan too. But there is a further point about those Russian demands which might be particularly pertinent at the moment, because, of course, one of the other demands contained in those draft treaties, which the Russians presented to the Americans just 2 weeks ago, was a demand that the United States eschew any further interference or involvement in the affairs of the republics of the former Soviet Union, one of which, of course, is Kazakhstan. Now, already there are people in Moscow, it's already appearing in the Russian media, and before long I suspect it will appear in the Chinese media too, which will say that these protests that are taking place in Kazakhstan are an attempt by some people both within Kazakhstan, local people, NGOs and people like that, but also perhaps people within the US embassy there, the various US intelligence agencies, those sort of people, to foment unrest in this key republic of the former Soviet Union in order to weaken and distract Russia in advance of those critical negotiations on the 10th of January, and perhaps to make clear to the Russians that this demand the Russians are making that the United States desist from further interference in the internal affairs of other Soviet republics, that the United States has no intention of abiding by that demand or accepting that demand, and that the United States has the power to stir up unrest in that region and is now actually doing so. Now, it's difficult to say what, if any, role the United States does actually have, and its intelligence agencies do in fact have, in these protests. Mr. Tokayev, in his various comments, including the latest comments that he's made, has all but said that there is foreign interference in Kazakhstan, which might suggest that he's prepared to make a break with Nazarbayev, that he no longer intends to pursue this this attempt to play the West off against the Russians that Nazarbayev used to do, and which Lukashenko and Belarus used to do, that once he fully regains control, which apparently he is now intent on doing, he's going to pursue a more strong policy of support for the Russian and Eurasian powers. Well, we'll see whether that turns out to be the case. We'll see also whether the security forces in Kazakhstan, which obviously have been shaped whilst Nazarbayev was in charge, whether they will in fact obey Tokayev's orders, whether they will follow his instructions, and whether he will be able to regain control. What I would say is that I personally would find it extremely surprising if the United States had not been aware of the fact that there were tensions in Kazakhstan. I'm sure the United States is extremely well informed about this. And given the realities of the way in which the US intelligence community, or parts of it, operate, I would not be surprised also if there were not some people within it who had seen this opportunity to create some trouble in Russia's backyard, precisely at a time when the United States and Russia are squaring off for difficult negotiations. That's purely a guess. I don't want to say that I have any direct knowledge of this. I'm sure people on the threads will have the same view, will have their various views, but it always seems to me that whenever these sort of situations arise in any country, one always has to look at a combination both of internal and external factors that are causing these problems, and as the situation in Kazakhstan is no exception. Now, I'm going to finish this program by making one last observation. Of course, if you read the Western media, or parts of the Western media, those parts of the Western media that have been covering these protests, inevitably and unavoidably you will read that this is all some great uprising against a dictatorship. And to be very clear, Nazarbayev's long rule over Kazakhstan was to a great extent a dictatorship. Having said that, I think that it is perhaps rather fanciful to see it purely in these terms as a challenge of battle between democracy and dictatorship, which is underway in Kazakhstan. Obviously, there have been demands, political demands, as part of these protests, but my overall sense is that the government in Kazakhstan, up to fairly recently, has been relatively stable and relatively widely supported within the country. So I don't get the sense that up to fairly recently, this was a particular ideological issue within the country. And as for Nazarbayev himself, the country's long-standing leader, dictator if you wish, well, of course, because he played the West off against Russia, all sorts of people in the West were on excellent terms with him. One of them was Tony Blair, recently knighted by the Queen, Sir Tony Blair, KG, as we must now call him, or perhaps I'm not going to call him, but some people no doubt will. But anyway, he and Nazarbayev were best of friends. And of course, if there were concerns about the fact that Nazarbayev was a dictator, it didn't ever seem to worry Tony Blair very much. Anyway, thank you for this program. No doubt more will become clear about what's going to happen in Kazakhstan over the next couple of hours and days. I'm going to say that I'm pretty sure that the Russians will be watching the situation very closely. And of course, there are treaty systems in place between Kazakhstan and Russia, which would allow Tokayev to call on Russia for assistance if it was needed in order to quell protests. And I'm pretty sure that if such a call were received, the Russians would respond positively, just as they did when they got a similar call from Lukashenko during the protests in Belarus. So we will see how things work out, whether Tokayev does manage to retain control, whether indeed he's able to consolidate control and become finally the true leader of the country, or whether he will lose the power struggle, which I suspect is still underway with Nazarbayev, and whether Kazakhstan will stabilize or destabilize, and what that will mean. An important event, definitely, one which certainly, as I said, the Russians are watching very carefully, one which the Chinese are watching equally carefully, and one which the United States will be following very closely as well, and which it might conceivably have had a hand in. Well, we shall see more. In the meantime, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon for further programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. You can also join me on my live streams on Locals, and join us indeed on our Locals platform. I'm doing a live stream. I do live streams regularly on Wednesday, and the next live stream, which is today, Wednesday, I'm making this program on Wednesday, will of course undoubtedly cover the topic of the situation in Kazakhstan. So more from me about the situation there in the live stream, and of course I'll be covering many other topics on the live stream too. So that's a live stream on Locals. You can join us on Locals, participate in that live stream, publish exclusive content, interact with Alex and me, and of course also publish your own content and interact with our community. And you can also find us on our various other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and all the rest. And you can also support us if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying yourself all these wonderful items you will find there, like these new amazing Duran mugs. And you can also support us by indicating whether you're liking for this video by ticking the like button, and by of course checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me soon, and have a very good day until then.